A really important thing that we're going to talk about a lot is line weight. This is something you're going to hear from your faculty all the time, is to make sure you've developed your line weight clearly. And what this refers to is the visual weight or intensity of the line on the paper. And the reason that this is important is that it is kind of the fundamental language of the graphic communication in technical drawings. Things that have a heavier weight stand out on the page and therefore present more emphasis to the viewer, and they'll see them first. Things that should fall to the background but are still important for establishing the page and the composition or the construction lines and things like that should be very light and almost fade away, but give us a sense of depth. And when we get into architectural drawings, this is really important for establishing depth. I'm going to make a kind of small example in the middle of my paper just to look at a few ways of producing line weight. I'm going to do a little 2-inch zone here, and starting, we'll just be doing some very light construction lines. That means my pencil is doing all the work. I'm not pushing at all. I'm just letting it flow down the page, making sure it's tight against a parallel rule to establish a couple of areas. And I'm going to block this off. Just have a work area. Not even going to worry about measuring it. Let's say it's close. I can always measure out from it to cut it out if I wanted to as a finished piece, but this is just an example to get a sense of drawing line weights. And hopefully we have both cameras here so we can really see how precise these can be. Now I use this tool for most of it, just because it's the one you're going to be using and is the most common and versatile, but you can also use mechanical pencils, and I'll show a couple there. Now, there's nothing overly complicated or tricky about this. Probably the hardest aspect is knowing and deciding when to use each line weight. And there are no exact answers, but there's a couple of ways to approach it. In an elevational drawing, something like the multi-view drawings that you're going to be exploring next week, or plan section, elevation and architecture, then you probably do it from a perceptual level, which means things that are closer to you generally have a heavier line weight, so they appear darker on the page and appear closer to you in person. Things that are further from you will generally have a lighter line weight, so they fade towards the background but still provide context. After that, when you get into three-dimensional projection, you have to use kind of different rules because depth is seen very differently. In perspective, the same type of elevational or perceptual rules might still be at play, whereas in an axonometric, they don't always work out because you have things that occupy the same place. You can kind of start from there and work from like corner elements back. What I tend to do in that case is then use slight difference between sides of an object so that they stand out, similar to how shadow might look in a photograph, so that we can get distinction of sides rather than hierarchy of sides. So line weight can be used for hierarchy and difference, and sometimes it's doing a little bit of both. Now you'll be doing an exercise for homework that does this in a little bit more expanded way, but we'll start pretty simple. I've just done some 1/4-inch measurements here so we can see things next to each other. I've done some 1/4-inch measurements here so we can see these line weights next to each other. What you'll want to do is create a palette for yourself, and this is basically what the homework is something you can keep next to you to reference to your line weights, from very, very light up to very, very heavy. You'll probably need 5 to 7, depending on the type of work you're doing. For our earlier stuff, 5 will do well. When we get into the computer, it's a little easier to expand. You might go to 7. Beyond that, it's kind of getting complicated and difficult to manage. And there are other things, like line type, that will also be at play. So I'm going to try to stay out of your way, and hopefully you can see very well in this. What I might do first, just to establish baseline, is use my pencil. This is an HB lead. You can use 2H for this as well. It makes it a little easier. I'm just going to draw some very light construction lines across a good portion of my page. Now, because I'm sitting way back, I seem to be having a little trouble connecting with my tick marks, but there we go. figured it out. And what I'm getting down here is my baseline for a construction line. Now if you're using a 2H pencil, it might be quite a bit lighter. You don't want to push at all so that pencil doesn't dig into the paper. And you do want to avoid things like this one where I missed a bit. I was pulling the pencil. It's okay for now. I'll leave it because we're going to go over it. But look out for those things and start to develop the habit of being consistent with it. There we go. And I won't need too many of these. Let's give myself plenty of room to experiment and practice. And since I probably don't want to start all the way over the top, I'm going to work a little more in the middle because it's a little easier for me to draw towards the middle and sitting back and off to the side like this. Again, you'll want to be directly over the work so you can see straight down and line everything up. So lots of times I'll be working standing. These drafting boards have little rubber feet on the bottom that can tilt up and down, and some legs in the back depending on what angle you want to be. And you can always prop them up on something if it helps you have a... You can always prop them up on something if it helps you have a better angle. I used to work with mine propped up almost vertical with a lower chair. It was easier on my back because a lot of those... It was easier on my back because a lot of the stools and desks in school were not made for someone of my height. But find your best position, whether you're at home or in the studio, to give you a comfortable place so you can work for many hours on a drawing. Now, you should take breaks, every 20 to 60 minutes, depending on your stamina. Just get up and stretch, move around, take deep breaths, so that you don't cramp up and get bad shoulders or wrist cramps or low back pain. So what I want to do is, let's start with one around here, and we'll call this very light. And everything above that is also very light. That's my baseline for the construction method. There's a couple ways you can do this. I think it can be helpful to go a few steps. So let's go 5 steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we'll start to label those. So then I'll have a light, a medium, a heavy, and a very heavy. And that should be a good spectrum to start with. I'm going to go and find my very heavy. So I have my light, my very light, and my very heavy to create a bracket around everything else and work from there. Now I'm going to practice a little bit down lower. So I use all these others for some practice. And a couple ways to draw heavier lines. One way, where I'm using a mechanical pencil, is using this one that has a heavier lead. So it's just going to make a thicker line. That can be really helpful. But if you don't have that, we'll go with our baseline tool. If you try by doing it with pressure, you don't want to do too much pressure because you'll snap your graphite or dig into the paper. But if I do like 2 medium pressure lines, it does definitely get darker. It has a limit to how far you can go because I can't push any more. Pushing any more, when I start to push more here, push pretty hard that time, it's the same level of darkness because the graphite itself just has a limit to its color. The technical way for building up line weight is by drawing lines next to each other until you build up a thicker line that appears heavier. So as a sample for that, what I can do is line up on my line I want to draw. Draw one. Now I'm just medium pressure, nothing very hard, moving my parallel rule just a little bit down so that the tip of my pencil draws another line overlapping the last one. Moving a little bit down, draw an overlapping line. I'm doing this a little slow because it might take a little while to get used to this. I'm going to go to what I think will be a very heavy one. And now you should be able to see that that line is standing out significantly more to the background. Now, doing very heavy lines will use up a good amount of lead very quickly, so you have to resharpen a lot while doing this, and you might use the secondary sharpening with the flatter tip for that. so that we can be sure to get a little bit more thickness with every stroke. And there we go, mine's already at that level. Someone's looking okay. I'm gonna take a few of these to practice because I'm a little rusty. There we go, we turn as we go. Move along, I want to get quick at it and decide how many is enough to be very heavy. And you might think, well, if we did one thin line for very light, you might do 5 thick lines for very heavy. And that's probably a good way to start thinking about it. Maybe it only takes 4 because we can get a bit more line weight out of this in the in-between levels. But I think that one's looking pretty good, and I did 4 passes there. It's very parallel and crisp. There's no fuzziness on either side of the line. That's what we want to avoid. We just want it to pop as a line, even though now it's becoming pretty thick. And you're only going to use these for rare instances of something like if you cut through an object and you want to show that it's been cut. If you're drawing a section of a building and you want to show the ground, things that are very heavy, as the line weight layer says, and help describe the boundary between 2 very distinct surfaces. Most of the time, heavy will do the trick for many visual depths. And you're going to work in this like medium range quite a lot, with the 2 on the outside being for establishing a little bit more depth and nuance. So let's come back up and try to recreate that here. And my very heavy, and I decided that 4 passes is pretty good. And as you're doing it, sometimes you might move the ruler just a little too far and have to move back to make sure you don't have any gaps. You don't want to have any gaps in the line. You want it to be one solid bar. I think that's looking pretty good. So I've got my very light and my very heavy. Let's come back up and do light just by drawing with normal moderate pressure, not really pressing, just drawing a line, letting the pencil weight and my hand weight push down rather than here where I was dragging a bit lighter. And so that seems good. 1 step light, 1 step darker. That would help me distinguish 2 things, something very far back and something a little forward. And I think I can get 1 more level of that here. Maybe I'll just do 2 passes really close to each other. All right, so it's starting to get a little bit darker. And we'll go to our next one, just do 3 passes. There we go. That's getting pretty good. Now I could expand this a little bit more. And when I do computer drawings, I also usually have a very, very heavy layer and a very, very light layer. And I can't go very, very light. Once you've gone heavy, there's no way to go lighter. So often when you draw, you'll do everything in like a light 2H pencil. It's all at the very, very light level, and then make another pass where you increase the line weight based on how you want the drawing to read. But let's go ahead and add in a very, very heavy here and see how that starts to look. At some point, because of the thickness of the lines, they begin to lose their quality of being a line and become more of a graphic. And so again, something like very, very heavy is more diagrammatic, more abstract, and it takes a bit of time to work on, and so it's worth having around when you need it, but probably not going to be deployed a lot. Same with very, very light. It's really hard to see. Now I could use this opportunity to mention a couple other little things about lines. Line weight is the place you want to start to get really good at this, and then starting to explore and understand where this helps you communicate visually. We also have other things, and you can reference Francis Ching for more about this, as well as line type. Line types are lines that have a specific quality to them to denote something important in a drawing. So for instance, a hidden line, which you might see as a dashed line, tells us when something is hidden from view, but is present, and we need to know about it for measurement purposes. So if I were to be drawing my hand, and there is a triangle behind it, I could do a dashed line here to tell me in the drawing that something is behind my hand and I might need to know about it. There are also center lines for helping us find the centers of circles, as well as phantom lines, border lines. So the trick with these lines is they require quite a bit of measurement. Sometimes you can use the eraser shield to do this. Right? So you could draw a regular line and put the eraser shield over it with those little dots. See if I can find a line. There we go. And if I came through with an eraser and just hit the top of that, it would erase segments of that line and give me a nice dashed line. So that's a quick way to do it. I don't think we have you buy a lettering guide anymore, but that had a lot of spacing on it for doing these as well. Or you can just use your ruler. But that's an important part of this, is you want something with measurement to do them. Like, I can draw a dashed line anywhere just by drawing dashes, but, and I wasn't trying very hard, I'm getting a lot of inconsistency, and that'll start to look really messy on a drawing. So if I really want to do a dashed line, I can use my ruler the same way I was doing. This triangle has a ruler on the edge, or I could bring a ruler over and start to choose my spacing increment and just use the ruler as my guide. I like to do a little bit longer dash and a little bit shorter space, maybe a 2-to-1 ratio. I think that reads well, but that can get even more confusing while you're trying to do your line dashes here. If I do a bigger one, so I'll go in this millimeters, I'll do an even dash first. So each one is just 5 millimeters. And that looks a lot cleaner. That's kind of helpful. But I find when you have a lot of this, that it's really hard for your eye to keep track on it if there's any other line on the page. And so it starts to like lose its consistency as a line. So for myself, I like to do one that uses a longer dash and a shorter gap. And they're a little close to each other, and that's another thing you can see is that if I draw up several of these anywhere near each other and they have varying gaps or even just like slightly offset from each other, they make a pretty messy visual field. But this, I think I did okay. Right? It's kind of a 2-to-1 ratio there. And that is not so far off probably from this here, right, where we have a much longer gap and a small, much longer dash and a small gap if we use that eraser shield. And that's really like the best thing to use. It's so much faster to just draw a light line and come through and use the eraser shield to make it dashed. Some other types of lines, center lines are nice. They're like a long dash, followed by a short dash, followed by a long dash. Something like that. And if you do them in both directions, this would be a little bit more challenging. I just really need the measurement, something as a guide, so I can do this. Short dash, long dash, short dash, long dash. Sorry, you can't see over my shoulder. Now that would denote the center of a circle. And that I can pre-establish before drawing a circle. And get out a compass or something like this circle wheel to line up to that center point. And with the compass then I can click it in place and come around and draw this. Ideally, you always want the pencil to move in this direction, never in this direction. It still draws the same, but it's more likely to chip and break and gonna get dusty, as well as have a chance to dig into your paper. It'll be good fine on this Bristol, but it might be a little problematic on some trace paper or vellum. I might line up another one of these just for fun. There. So that's an introduction primarily to line weight, thing we'll talk about a lot, how you develop it by sequential layering of line to give them more distinct value or leave them with less distinct value. We always start here and work our way to what we want for visual clarity. Now, if I was in high school, I would have gotten in a lot of trouble with my drafting teacher about that arrow, but We don't draft the same way anymore. The computer can make arrows for us. So right now we're really learning how to see difference and how to establish difference by the way that we communicate through lines and drawings.